Welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Church of San Antonio for our Sunday gathering. My name is Tess Bobo, and I'm a at-large member of the Board of Trustees. I'm a lifelong UU. I joined this church when I moved to San Antonio 20 years ago. I've served in many volunteer positions, including social justice, trust fund of endowments, leadership development, but most of my time was as an Our Whole Lives teacher. I value this church because it believes in teaching that empowers our children, youth, and adults. To begin, we acknowledge this place where we are currently located, the home of and traditional lands of the Tonkawa Payaya peoples of the Coahuiltecan Band, original and indigenous stewards of this land that is now called San Antonio, Texas, now claimed as part of the United States of America. I'd like to continue to welcome you with these words written by the Reverend Leslie Takahashi Morris, entitled With Our Wild Imaginings That a Better World is Possible. Come, come, whoever you are, with your hurts, your imperfections, your places that feel raw and exposed. Come, come, whoever you are, with your strengths the world shudders to hold, with your wild imaginings of a better world, with your hopes that it seems no one wants to hear. We will make a place for you. We will build a home together. Ours is no caravan of despair. Come, yet again, come. Our faith is all-inclusive, and all means all. If you are new to us or visiting for the first time today, we welcome you to sign on the chat stream. We'd like to get to know you and follow up with you. Wherever you are on your life's journey, we hope you will find your place with us.
Good morning, I am Deanna.
Audrey. Matthew.
And we are the Campbell family.
When I light this chalice, I hear an invitation to welcome gratitude.
I am grateful that we are blessings for each other.
We are called as Unitarian Universalists to build the beloved community where all are welcome as blessings, and the human family lives in forgiveness and grace, whole and reconciled. We know that this aim takes work, and so we are committed to live and behave as a community in covenant. Let's recite our covenant that articulates our guidelines and binds us together in community. The words can be found on your screen. Love is the doctrine of this church, the quest for truth of its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humanity in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other.
Good morning. My name is David Rodriguez. Welcome to our service today. Our opening words are taken from the Lakota Sioux Chief Yellow Lark from 1887. It's titled Great Spirit Prayer. O Great Spirit, whose voice I hear in the winds and whose breath gives life to all the world, hear me. I need your strength and wisdom. Let me walk in beauty and make my eyes ever hold the red and purple sunset. Make my hands respect the things you have made, and my ears sharp to hear your voice. Make me wise so that I may understand the things you have taught my people. Let me learn the lessons you have hidden in every leaf and rock. Help me remain calm and strong in the face of all that comes toward me. Help me find compassion without empathy overwhelming me. I seek strength, not to be greater than my brother, but to fight my greatest enemy, myself. Make me always ready to come to you, with clean hands and straight eyes, so when life fades as the fading sunset, my spirit may come to you without shame. Ours is a welcoming community where we find connection, a spiritual community where we find meaning. Ours is a sharing community where our joys are amplified, a caring community where our sorrows are lessened. We take this moment to reflect on our joys and sorrows and acknowledge the mutual support of our community. Let's join in silent meditation as we write our joys and sorrows on the chat screen while Jaime plays the meditation music. May we remember those who have spoken, those that were named, and those we hold in silence in our hearts. I offer up a Sioux prayer. Grandfather, Great Spirit, all over the world the faces of living ones are alike. With tenderness they have come up out of the ground. Look upon your children that they may face the winds and walk the good road to the day of quiet. Grandfather, Great Spirit, fill us with the light. Give us the strength to understand and the eyes to see. Teach us to walk the soft earth as relatives to all that live. They are not dead who live in the hearts they leave behind. This quote from the Tuscarora tribe quite succinctly sums up the battle that has been the history of indigenous people here in the United States. Their real history is often forgotten and misrepresented. and replaced with convenient myths to propagate nationalism and cover up the colonial and the brutal expansionist history of the United States. From a Unitarian Universalist perspective, we also have some work to do to address our part in these myths. I will share with you this true report from a cross-cultural conversation about misappropriation that happened after the UUA General Assembly in Seattle in 2007. Reverend Danielle DiBona began the session by describing her initial experience in Seattle. She had attended the service of the Living Tradition, and the program included the hymn, "We'll Build a Land." When DiBona, a Wampanoag Indian, saw hundreds of mostly white faces in the hall singing this, she thought about how white European culture indeed had built on Native American land. Knowing all this was done at the expense of Native culture caused her great pain. DiBona shared these feelings with Keith Arnold, who had helped plan the service. Arnold, who was president of the UU Musicians Network, initially replied that he would never sing the song again. But DiBona assured him that he could, now that she had been heard. Arnold told the attendees he will always remember her story when he sings it. This experience has changed how he thinks of this song, he said, using other ears. As a people of faith, we need to think deeper about the intention of our words and the implications they carry. I hope we can move forward with more sensitive eyes to the impact of the history of Indigenous peoples. I am going to read the story called The Golden Flower. It is an old Taino myth from the indigenous peoples of the island, which we now call Puerto Rico, but in their time they called the island Boriquen. Long ago, the island of Puerto Rico was called Boriquen. This was the name given to it by the first people who lived there, the Taino. From time to time, the families in a Taino village would stop their work and gather together for a celebration called an areito. All through the night they would dance and sing. Then young and old would gather together in a great circle and listen to stories of magic and wonder, of Taino heroes, and of how things came to be. As you read this book, imagine that you too are sitting in this magic circle on a warm, tropical night. The wind is blowing through the palm trees, the stars twinkle in the sky, and the storyteller begins to weave an ancient myth, a Taino tale from long ago. In the beginning of the world, there was no water anywhere on earth. There was only a tall mountain that stood alone on a wide desert plain. There were no green plants, there were no flowers. All the people lived on top of this mountain. One day a child went walking on the dry land below the mountain. As he bent down over the ground looking for food, something floated by on the wind. He reached out and caught it in his hand. It was a seed, a small brown seed. He put the seed into his pouch. The next day he went walking and again found something as it floated by on the wind. It was another seed. Day by day he gathered these seeds until his pouch was full. It could not hold any more, and the child said to himself, "I will plant these seeds at the top of our mountain." He planted the seeds and waited. One morning a tiny green leaf appeared. The child watched. From under the ground a forest began to grow high on top of the mountain. All the people came to see. It was a forest of many colored flowers, a magic garden of green leaves and thick branches. The child was happy. In the middle of the forest, at the foot of the tallest tree, there grew a vine that wrapped itself around the tree. And from that vine there grew a flower more beautiful than all the rest, a bright flower with golden petals. And from that flower, something new appeared in the forest. It looked like a little ball. "Look," cried the child, "something is growing out of the flower." As the people gathered around to watch, the ball grew larger and larger until it became a great yellow globe that shone like the sun. Even as they walked on the dry land far below, people could see it shining on top of the mountain. One woman said, "If you put your ear next to the ball, you can hear strange noises coming from inside." The people listened. Strange sounds and murmuring could be heard, but nobody knew what was hidden inside. The people were afraid. After that, they all stayed away. Even the child stayed away. One day, a man walking on the desert plain saw the golden ball. He said, "If that shining ball were mine, I would have the power of the sun. I could light up the sky or make darkness fall." And he ran toward it, climbing up the rocky mountainside. On the other side of the mountain, another man saw the shining globe, and he also said, "I want that thing for myself. It will give me great powers." He too began to run. Each one climbed quickly. Each one found the footpath that led to the tree. They both ran without stopping until they reached the shining globe at the same time. But what they found was not really a ball. It was the fruit of the golden flower, a calabaza, a pumpkin. The two men began to fight and argue. "It is mine," said one. "No, it is mine," said the other. Each man grabbed the pumpkin. They pushed and pulled, and tugged until... Finally, the vine broke. The pumpkin began to roll down the mountain faster and faster until it crashed into a sharp rock and burst apart. Whoosh! Waves of water poured out of the pumpkin. The water bubbled and foamed. The waves began to cover the earth, flooding the desert plain, rising higher and higher. For it was the sea that had been hidden inside the pumpkin. Out came the creatures, whales, dolphins, crabs, and sunfish. All the people ran to the top of the mountain to hide in the forest of green leaves. "Will the whole earth be covered?" they cried. Higher and higher the waters kept rising, up the sides of the mountain. But when the water reached the edge of the magic forest the little boy had planted, it stopped. The people peeked out from behind the leaves, and what did they see? Small streams running through the trees, a beach of golden sand, and the wide open ocean sparkling all around them. Now the people could drink from the cool streams and splash in the rippling waves. Now they could gather fish from the flowing tides and plant their crops. The child laughed and sang as the sun shone down and breezes blew through the green leaves and rustled the many-colored flowers. Water had come to the earth. And that is how the Taínos say, between the sun and the sparkling blue sea, their island home, Boriquen, came to be. As we enter the time for our offering, please know that your gifts contribute to the many workings of this church. Your gifts are a necessary part of carrying forth the message and the mission of this church. Please consider making an offering on our online giving portal through the link on the chat while we enjoy the music of Chuck Gibbons. I thank those that gave just now and those that continue to give through other means. Your gifts are much appreciated by the members of this congregation and further the vision of this church. The following video interview is of Professor Haunani K. Trask in 1990. Professor Trask is a Hawaiian nationalist, educator, political scientist, author, and professor emeritus at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Trask is the producer of the award-winning documentary Act of War, The Overthrow of the Hawaiian Nation in 1993. This interview in 1990 was in response to a letter written by a 32-year-old Caucasian student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and published in the local newspaper. The student claimed the Hawaiian word haole, spelled H-A-O-L-E, was derogatory toward whites and equated it to the N-word. In response, Professor Trask published an article in the same paper and provided a brief history of Hawaii, discussed the decline of our language, and highlighted the narrative of white supremacy in America. Following her response came a flood of controversy which included threats to remove her from the university. In spite of the uproar, Trask was able to keep her position and go on to inspire leaders across many Pacific Island tribes. I came upon this video by chance and I thought two things. One, the importance to highlight the still ongoing struggle for Native Hawaiians to become an independent nation. They have no political status currently with the United States federal government. Secondly, I wanted you to see the passion and hear the voice of an indigenous person and how the struggle for self-determination is so real and so impactful. She is a great speaker, and I hope you research more about her fight for Hawaiian independence. She lays her position out very clearly and very succinctly.
Haunani K., go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yes, well, I just would like to comment that it's very telling that the first thing you open the show with is a statement about Hawaiians would benefit from one less haole in Hawaii. That is what haoles always pick on. They never want to talk about the history. Listen, this is my opportunity to speak, and now I'm going to speak. They never want to include the history. And as you know, because you have the article with you, that statement is made at the end of my argument. The argument is preceded by a defense of the word haole, which we need to start with Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, who is a 32-year-old student, or was, is haole. He wrote into Kaleo, the student newspaper, saying he didn't like the word. He thought that the use of the word was haole bashing. That was part of his argument. My reply to him was a defense in the very first paragraph of that word. Why did I defend that word? Because the Hawaiian language was officially banned by an all-haole government, Bob, in 1900. That's very important.
I'm not disputing those historical facts.
Let me have my say.
Let me say, I didn't like his letter any better than I like yours.
Let me have my say. You've had a long time to interpret what I said. I want to say to the listening, viewing public, what is consistently left out of my analysis. That includes what you left out, what the philosophy department leaves out, what everybody else leaves out. And that is the history of white supremacy, not only in Hawaii, but in the United States. I mentioned in that same article that in the American Constitution, blacks were 3/5 of a person. That was also left out by yourself and by other people. I mentioned genocide and removal of American Indians. I mentioned the fact that Asians were beaten because they were called the Yellow Peril, and that Japanese were interned during the Second World War, and that Native Hawaiians were dispossessed and their lawful government overthrown. Now, to leave all of those things out, and there are many other things that I haven't even mentioned about the contemporary status of Native Hawaiians, is really to inflame the response of the listening public who says, well, wait a minute, why did she say that? And my response is, I am saying that not only because it is historically and factually correct. Hawaiians would certainly benefit from less haoles in Hawaii. Many, not just one, but thousands, as Tahitians would benefit from less French, if it can't be no French, as the Maoris would benefit from no Pākehās, as American Indians would benefit from no white Americans, because those people are settlers in native lands, and they are living on stolen land. Now, my advice to Mr. Carter was, you had better learn where you are, which is the same advice I give to the philosophy department, which is in Hawaii. You are not in some white place, otherwise known as Europe. You're in a native place, and you are living on stolen land. So you have an obligation, number one, to understand the history of that place, which Mr. Carter does not want to understand, which Mr. Loudon of the philosophy department does not want to understand. And number two, you owe us something. Now the question is, what do people owe us? Howleys owe us getting rid of their ignorance. They are so ignorant about Hawaii. They think they can fly here and say, oh, well, we're a numerical minority. We're unhappy here. Well, what I say to them is, learn where you are. You are not just off the coast of Southern California. You are in Polynesia, a stolen colony. That's what we are. We are a stolen colony. The United States has colonies. We are a colonized people. Number two, learn the history. That's what I was trying to say to Joey Carter. Learn the history of white supremacy. Now, what does white supremacy consist of? Well, Mr. Carter didn't know this. Our language was officially banned. All Hawaiian language schools were closed. Who is Mr. Carter or any other white person to tell a Hawaiian we cannot use the word haole? That is our word. Now, white people don't like that because they're used to being the people who name other people. And so they come here and they think that that word is a bad word. They think it's pejorative. It's not pejorative, it's descriptive. Just like the name we have for Hawaiians is Nau'iwi in Hawaiian. We are the native people. The other thing Howleys need to understand is what are the contemporary conditions that Hawaiians endure today. Continued land dispossession, continued water loss, continued bad health, which we just discussed last night. All of these things, Howleys owe us. Just as if you went to Kenya, or you went to Tahiti, or you went to Palestine, you would owe those people there an understanding and a respect for their culture. And Mr. Carter has no respect for Hawaiians. So he complained about the word haole. He complained about being, what he said, imposed upon. And my response to him was, if you don't like it, you can leave.
The wealth of history of indigenous peoples makes it impossible to present a full picture in a short sermon. I hope you have already gotten some idea of what the fight is like through the words of Professor Trask and her fight for Hawaiian independence. We also got to experience the perspective of a Native American through the lens of a UU hymn and the interpretation it brings. Then we heard a simple folk tale about the creation of an island told from the indigenous people that are no longer alive. A ghost story from history. As Unitarian Universalists, we have a faith tradition that prides itself on drawing from varied sources. I will draw today on the spiritual teachings of earth-based religions, specifically the indigenous peoples that live in North America, several of which I have presented already. From them, we learn the value of taking care of the land, and that the land does not belong to anyone, it belongs to all of us. Indigenous people honor the land and the spirits that infuse them. They believe in the power of circles, in the cycles of the seasons, in the life of a person from child to adult to death, in the teepees and hogans where they lived, and in the spiritual dances around the rings of fire. Through their way of life and their beliefs, we come to understand the balance between life and nature. And as we take care of nature, it takes care of us. This is such an important lesson for our times today, with the pandemic raging, wildfires raging out of control, and the disconnected nature of our existence today as we rely more and more on technology. The main source for my talk today is the book An Indigenous People's History of the United States, written by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz in 2014. In the book, published by the Beacon Press, she attempts to present a history of the indigenous peoples that lived in the lands that would later become the United States, from the perspective of the indigenous peoples themselves. The book is very comprehensive and explores a diverse group of peoples here in North America with intricate trade systems, ways of life, and spiritual practices. They ended with a much smaller group of people that were forced off their lands by war, disease, and broken treaties onto segregated reservations with little resources. Many of you may or may not know all the stories that led to the current situation that many indigenous people now live, but this book uncovers them all in all their sad detail. I highly recommend you read it. It is so important to understand the history of a group of people to then understand the current situation that they now face. This goes for indigenous people as well as Africans, Latinos, Europeans, and other peoples that came to the lands of America either by choice or by force. You cannot understand the current situation and resolve the current problems if you do not understand the history. You cannot really understand who you are as a person, group of people, or a country until you do. When I was younger, starting out in my professional life after college, I began my true education about who I was and what the legacy of my country was about. There were opportunities in high school and college to learn history and delve deeper into topics, but it was not until I had the freedom to define my own coursework that I really began to understand fully the gaps in my knowledge of the founding and goals of the United States. I was fortunate to work in New York City at the time, and the long commutes on trains afforded me a lot of time to read and learn. My formal education was good, but there were clearly gaps in my knowledge of Latino cultures, African American writers and their history, and the histories of indigenous peoples. I realize now what a great opportunity that was to learn these things during that time, as it seems I have less time to read now. I was also fortunate to listen to a great alternative independent radio station out of New York called WBAI. They still bill themselves as a source of free speech radio on 99.5 FM. They presented programming from all cultures and across all political spectrums. It is the original home of Amy Goodman, who you may know as the investigative journalist on the news program Democracy Now! At the time I was listening, she was the host of the morning news program that would eventually become the Democracy Now! Program that is now broadcast across the United States. You can't rely on one source of news for history or any kind of spiritual awareness. There are alternate sources of information that cover all sorts of topics that get little to no coverage on the regular outlets. There really is another world, so to speak, beneath what is widely covered. I remember WBAI doing extensive reporting on the shooting of Amadou Diallo, an immigrant from Guinea, who was brutally shot by police in New York in 1999. The type of coverage they gave this story with interviews with the family gave me great insight into the situation then that we now find ourselves more today with the Black Lives Matter movement. I understand that some people disagree with the Black Lives Matter movement, largely because they do not realize that the history of this abuse goes far back and was far too common. Knowing the history is important to understanding the issues of the day and the anger and frustration that still exists. These things do not manifest out of thin air. They are the product of long histories of events. So in Miss Dunbar-Ortiz's comprehensive history of events of indigenous peoples, we find the missing stories and histories, stories that lead one to understand where indigenous people are today and the problems they continue to face. She does a convincing job of dispelling the myths and falsehoods about their complicated history. Miss Dunbar-Ortiz begins her narrative with the relations between the early European settlers and the indigenous people whose lands they invaded. From the beginning, she makes it clear to understand that this was an invasion of settled lands by European settlers. These were not discovered lands, as is so often told. These lands were already settled by many different peoples with a full way of life, trade, and travel. The early European settlers were fortunate in that they were not seen as an invading force. It is clear the native peoples did not understand the threat to their way of life until it was too late. Though help was given to the early settlers to survive those first winters, it was not done so to encourage more settlers to come and to broaden the exchange of trade. The myth of native peoples and early European settlers having this symbiotic friendly relationship is a fallacy. If the native peoples in the time of Jamestown and Plymouth knew fully of the havoc that was coming, by helping these early settlers survive, they may have thought differently about helping them survive. The myth of the United States being one nation, united like a melting pot of cultures, is also dispelled by Miss Dunbar-Ortiz. The fact that there are over 570 federally recognized tribes and various territories and commonwealths owned by the United States speaks more truthfully to the many recognized entities that are not quite united with the United States, but working within it. To say that there is a united culture here disavows the cultures that are involved here and whitewashes their relevance and influence. In her opinion, this is a way of covering up the history of colonialism that was part of the growth of the United States and continues to be practiced, an opinion shared by many, including Professor Haunani K. Trask. Native Hawaiians continue to have no legal designation at the federal level, whether as a tribe or independent nation. Recently, the legacy of the past heroes of the United States have come under question. Patriots like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who were slave owners, led the effort through their presidencies to expand the lands of the United States by taking it from the native people who lived on it for centuries. This is a problematic legacy for indigenous people to rally behind. Andrew Jackson in particular was ruthless in his efforts to eradicate native peoples from their lands. The debate over how to continue to honor the legacy of these historical figures is a challenge, and I can offer no clear solution. I think it is important to understand their roles in history and understand why they took the courses of action that they did. Most of us try to make the best decisions we can based on what we know at the time, and perhaps some allowance can be made for bad decisions based on poor information. But how can they make up for the bad decisions that were made which had such devastating effects to the indigenous peoples across the North American continent? The United States history is filled with bad decisions regarding the treatment of indigenous peoples. Understanding the effects those decisions had and continue to have on them will hopefully bring about some reparations to the indigenous peoples. One of the greater tragedies, and there were many, in the handling of the indigenous people in the United States was the forced migration and resettlement of peoples across the United States, Oklahoma being the worst example. Oklahoma was considered Indian territory and was the preferred destination for the United States to send indigenous tribes as their lands were taken. Currently, Oklahoma is home to 39 federally recognized tribes, but only 5 of them were indigenous to that area. The forced migrations were a tremendous burden to the native peoples involved, with many dying on the way there and others dying of the poor conditions later. The uprooting of their cultures, the changing of their identities, and severing ties to their native lands were all enormous obstacles for many native people. It cannot be understated the effects this migration had on the spirits of these native peoples. Though many have continued to survive on the lands in Oklahoma, certainly the loss is still felt and impacting their daily lives to this day. There were many atrocities committed over the years by the United States and by native peoples in the struggles to coexist on the lands of North America. To go through them all is important in understanding the events, but I will leave that to you to read about in due time. It is also not just the violence that was perpetrated, but the forced assimilation through boarding schools and adoptions that also carved a hole into the native people's culture and legacy. Though some schools and programs were helpful and some amends have been made since, there is still so much work to do to rectify the centuries of damage, abuse, and broken treaties. Understanding the history of what was done goes a long way to understanding what can be done in the future to help many of the indigenous people of the United States get out of poverty and the poor state of conditions that many live in today. As a people of faith, with a wealth of sources to draw on and the gumption to work towards a more civil and just society, it is important that in light of the efforts of Black Lives Matter, that we also put forth the effort to help the cause of our indigenous people. We can't stand by and let the misguided narratives of the past dictate the ambivalence of future efforts. The indigenous survivors of today still carry a wonderful legacy of earth-centered beliefs that are relevant to our spiritual journey today. Once we can come to grips with our legacy and how we can rectify the mistakes of the past, we can move forward as a country of peoples, a country of nations that carry forth a legacy of caring and compassion for each other and the land we share. We need to listen to all the sources of our faith and make good judgments based on them all. I am not here to say that the United States is an evil empire. There are reasons, whether good or bad, for the decisions that were made along the way. We need to look towards better solutions and not deny the rights of peoples to have their say and to keep their cultural identities intact. It is about making this country better, not about demonizing the past. There are still many wonderful opportunities for success here in the United States and that you can find nowhere else. Let's make sure that we include everyone in those opportunities and that they have a say in describing that narrative. Whether it is the Navajo, Inuit, Cherokee, or Pacific Islander, or Puerto Rican or African American, we all make this country our home, and we all deserve a chance to have a say in how it runs and how we can contribute to it. Who are we really? We are a country of many cultures whose strengths lie in the many facets of all our knowledge and beliefs. Despite the atrocities of the past, we have the potential to be something so much more. Our faith dictates we be at the forefront of that progress. Let us not lose hope and instead feel pride in the influence that Indigenous peoples have had on our lives and our faith. All our sources are worthy of that pride. Thank you. I thank you for being with us for this short time today. I will leave you with this Native American prayer. O Great Spirit who dwells in the sky, lead us to the path of peace and understanding. Let all of us live together as brothers and sisters. Our lives are so short here, walking upon Mother Earth's surface. Let our eyes be open to all the blessings you have given us. Please hear our prayers, O Great Spirit. After our postlude by Jaime, we invite you to join in conversation during our coffee hour time at the link shown on the chat. Please join with us. If you are not available or interested in the coffee hour, we thank you for being with us today and trust you will take good care of yourself, making something special happen today, and that we hope to see you soon again.